The vast majority of working artists did not go to art school. The vast majority of folks that go to art school do not become working artists. And that's not to say anything critical about art school. It's just that there are different paths that most people take. And so we're trying to step into a space that formal academic art schools don't always or not always able to, and be much more involved with local communities first, as opposed to curricular structures or academic bureaucracy.
Hello and welcome to Art Restart, where we learn from artists who, wherever they work, whatever they make, are shaking up the status quo in their fields and in their communities. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, which is brought to you by the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with architect, educator, and founder of Raleigh's small school, JP Reuer. What is small school? Well, I'll let JP explain it to us, but for now, I will say that it is the labor of love of a man who has long dreamed of finding ways to make arts education more accessible, more collaborative, and deeply embedded in local culture. Small schools started out as one idea, then became something else, and it continues to adapt and evolve. And that's what's exciting about it. JP spoke to me from his home in Raleigh. I started off by asking him to walk us through how he started cooking up the ideas that would eventually become small school.
Well, okay, so the beginning really is an accidental step into academia a little over 20 years ago when I started teaching for Virginia Commonwealth University School of the Arts in Qatar. And I was able to run a fairly large conference there. And through that work, we could address social and environmental topics that previously had not been. And I really got a bug for working with artists and designers on issues that I thought were important, and was lucky to work with really talented folks. So kind of project-based initiatives became part of something I was interested in.
Can I ask you, you said issues that had not been explored through this kind of program before. Can you give me an example?
Well, for instance, we, would take students out with visiting artists and designers during the conference to migrant housing situations. And, some of the students had never seen that. And those are part of a kind of human rights concern in that area that we tried to initiate conversations about, in very respectful ways. And then some of the construction practices around sustainability we would highlight. And through that conference, I was invited by the Queen essentially to consult on a major design project. So what that taught me was that, if you want to talk about important topics that affect all of us and do it in a way that feels respectful and inviting, opportunities follow or might follow. And from all of that work within academia, I wasn't familiar with academia that operated like that previously. I started to feel like maybe there's a place for me here. I never thought I would be in academia. Both my parents were academics, and I swore I would never do that. And then I was invited to apply for a position on the West Coast to start a new MFA in applied craft and design, which was similarly public engagement focused and, learning by making and learning by doing. And through that MFA experience and co-authoring a couple of other MFA programs while out there, I thought there might be a way to provide the kind of learning that the students there were getting in a way that was more direct and much more affordable. At the same time, I saw the beginning of the closing of many art schools, and we've had so many that have closed over the last 10 years. It's really remarkable. It's sad. And, another component of, the conditions or the context in which I started thinking about starting a new thing was some of the predictability of the student work in MFA programs. Very good, really thoughtful, but a little bit predictable and not showing, I think, the full range of expression that you have from within our society at large. So I thought it might be interesting to try to find ways to include people that might not otherwise go the route of an MFA. And when I started talking about this with some folks in Portland, where I was, Portland, Oregon, about doing something independent, one of my colleagues said, "Oh, that sounds great. Why don't you do it?" And I thought, "Oh no, he's called my bluff."
Totally.
And so I had to, I took that seriously, and that was 2012, 13, maybe. And so I've been kind of working on it since then, and we launched a couple of years ago.
So tell me, how far along are you?
Well, I mean, we've come a long way, but we're still at, I think a stage of infancy. Part of that has to do with this back and forth that I think is common in any new endeavor, where you have to develop enough of a kind of a prototype that you have a model, you can describe a model,
Hmm.
and then you have to test it. And testing something like this is not easily doable in the abstract. You have to kind of run it out there in real life, and through that process you get a lot of feedback, and you learn what is resonating, what isn't, and what is either too administratively overwhelming or not relevant enough to enough people. Initially the idea was that we would launch something like an MFA or something very similar in a building with facilities, etc. And
In downtown Raleigh,
in
right?
downtown Raleigh,
Hmm.
yeah. And the positive um, the positive thing about starting like that was that the vision seemed compelling to some people that are influential, and so they helped in terms of making introductions to other people that could help facilitate the development. And we were getting some traction. I had met with all the city council folks in Raleigh about the project, and they were all enthusiastic, and I felt pretty confident that they would provide support, in terms of space, starter space, and an incubation period. And then COVID hit, and all that went away, and that was really disappointing. But it made us think about the model, like how can we continue to move forward in this context. And we let go of the real estate piece, and
Oh.
that was incredible relief. I mean, I did it was first you go through this period of disappointment and a sense of failure. We didn't work. But then wait a second, do we actually need a building? I mean, we've been trying to raise 10 or 12 million dollars, and I don't know that we can, but we can probably get started with programming, and through that programming and small projects start to learn and build a community and build awareness. And so that's what happened. Maybe it took 2 years or something like that to move from the disappointment to the actual first event. But it was important that that happened, because I think that had I continued with the original model, I think I nothing would have really come to fruition.
So is the plan still, you think, in the future to offer a degree program?
I not now.
Uh
I don't.
huh.
I mean, it's so far. I mean, if that happened, I think that would be so far. That would be such a different model than what we're looking at now. Partially because I mean, there's an issue of scale when you try to launch, an accredited degree program. The administrative costs become significant, and that means that either you have to have a larger student body tuition paying student body to offset the costs, and more significant in terms of amount of financial support from grants and other awards, foundation support, etc. It just seems pretty ambitious for where we are. Plus, and maybe as important or more important, the vast majority of working artists did not go to art school. The vast majority of folks that go to art school do not become working artists. And that's not to say anything critical about art school. It's just that there are different paths that most people take. And so we're trying to step into a space that formal academic art schools don't always or not always able to, and be much more involved with local communities first, as opposed to curricular structures or academic bureaucracy.
Right. And so I notice you're offering your first fellowships. Is that correct?
That's the goal. We're still, the fundraising exhibition that you saw this weekend was the first fundraising event. And we're getting ready to start a crowdfunding campaign. And depending on how successful those are, we will launch a fellowship in the fall. There's absolutely no shortage of interest on the artist side. That part we're confident in, but we need to raise money.
So you yourself clearly went to art school. You're trained as an architect, and you have taught at least two major programs. And like you said, not artists don't need to go to art school to be artists. So what are you hoping in terms of the model that you're envisioning? How are you hoping to kind of reinvent the advanced art education system? What do you think artists need without going into debt to go to art school?
I think that the proliferation of MFAs was a good thing in terms of providing opportunities for people to learn through art making and through art. It was unrealistic in terms of suggesting that all the folks that went and got MFAs would be able to survive as working artists, or in many cases get jobs teaching art.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a common disappointment for MFA grads, is realizing that, wow, I'm not really going to be able to get a teaching gig. That for a long time, that was the model for artists, for many artists, is like, I'm going to teach and that will be my income. And then I can make art that doesn't rely on producing income. Both this small school and the program I ran in Portland, I told students that this is not a program that is designed for you to become an art academic. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just unrealistic for many people. And, the market is flooded with folks that are very, very good with that.
Let me ask you then,
Yeah.
especially thinking back on your Portland days, what was it about your program that made it not geared for artists who were hoping to become academics?
We had something called a practicum, which was initially, I think the idea was basically that the artists would do something similar to an internship, some applied project with a community or a business or a civic organization that combined their academic research with their skills in making work. So the idea was to evolve and explore ways for artists to become more common members of society, where just like you may meet someone at some social event and they're an engineer or a nurse or whatever kind of recognizable job, and you don't other them. So we were trying to find a way for artists to be more common, in terms of you don't necessarily question or put them in a box that they're this cliched version of an artist, or someone that you worry about, oh, how are you going to make a living, and those kinds of thoughts. That was the ambition, and we still have that ambition here.
And tell me about what kind of artists that kind of ethic or that way of thinking creates, that being
Yeah.
part of the community, being practical. Yeah, tell me about, as opposed to being in kind of like the ivory or
Yeah.
marble tower.
Well, I mean, I think number one, your audience or others in general are more considered in your practice and often included. We were not a social practice program, but there were many folks that were interested in social practice, and there was that influence. So that could mean that even the conception of a project would be initiated through some kind of participation with others, or the fabrication of it. There's a range of ways that other people can be involved. And the point really is that many people don't feel comfortable or invited or included in art settings, whether it's a gallery or a museum or an artist talk.
That's true for artists and non-artists alike, right?
Yes,
Hmm.
yeah. And so we were trying to overcome that obstacle and that tradition.
You talked about testing things, testing ideas, and
Yeah,
one thing you
yeah,
learned, for instance, is that real estate, which can sink so many organizations, is not your goal.
right.
What else have you tested?
I think that we test what gets people excited about what we're doing. And, for me, one initial thought at the very beginning was we would have this fairly, much more robust and intense lecture slash performance series. And it would be this kind of, and downtown. And this was all before COVID and before George Floyd and significant events that have impacted downtown, and that we would have this energy that came from both, an urban setting of discussions and sort of, the idea of the public intellectual. And that's ambitious anywhere, but I think in a smaller city it was too ambitious, and so we've scaled back on the frequency, partially because there isn't a large enough population, and maybe there are other, just in terms of scheduling, there are other things going on that not everyone can attend. I think we're in a good spot right now where we're, at most twice a month, but we're moving more towards once a month, and we're getting better participation because of that. The biggest kind of surprise, and happy surprise, has been the studio visits, where the visiting artist spends an hour or so with a local artist in their studio. And it made sense immediately after I recognized it, but I didn't foresee it, that it's easier to talk to a stranger. And so when a visiting artist comes in, the local artist can have sometimes a more candid conversation, or reveal some aspects of their practice or what they're exploring in ways that they wouldn't otherwise, because it's common for artists, I think, to try to form critique groups with their peers, which are
Hmm.
great, but they tend to peter out after a short time, just because it's hard to keep the structure going. And if you know that you're going to run into someone in the coffee shop or the grocery store, maybe you hold back, or maybe you don't
Hmm.
share quite as freely. So the studio visits have been a great, staple of the visiting artist's itinerary or their program here. We've done a lot of workshops. We're doing more project-based work. We had one, Alan Sonfist, who's kind of a pioneer, land art pioneer. We did a project here with the North Carolina Forestry Service that we exhibited at CAM, and then it was exhibited at Art Basel Miami. And next month we have Chip Thomas, who's an artist who's been working with the Navajo for 30 years.
Yeah, a past guest here
Oh,
on this
right.
podcast.
That's right.
That's right.
Chip.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
well, yeah. So hopefully we'll, be able to, get together with Chip when he's here next month. But he'll be here for a residency and doing a public art work.
Since you first got the idea for the small school in 2012, 2013, what are you proudest of? I'm sure there's been so much testing and learning and
Primarily, it's the response and acknowledgement from folks that I've worked with, whether they're students or peers or colleagues, in terms of just finding the time and experience meaningful and valuable. I get a big kick out of working hard with people and experimenting, and often, it's common for an artist visiting to, especially if there's someone I haven't worked with before, to not really know what small school is, and to ask a few questions and then realize that we are we're developing what it is. It's not a stable model yet, and artists are really comfortable working with the unknown. And
Which architects, I imagine, are not.
well, I mean, maybe initially it's fine, but when it
Yeah.
comes time to produce something that you have to build and be paid for, it's more difficult.
So yeah, what are you hearing? You've worked with a lot of really amazing visiting artists. What are you hearing from them about your vision?
Well, I mean, in general, they love it, and I don't think you would have seen the work that we had on display this weekend from really wonderful artists if they didn't feel supportive of what we're trying to do.
Right, because most of the money earned was going to you were sharing the proceeds from that sale with them. They were
Correct.
giving that's amazing. That's
Yeah.
really wonderful. And what do you wish you could go back to 2013 and whisper in your ear about this project?
I mean, the real answer is that I don't know that it could be done, that I could have done it any differently. That the things that I learned the hard way or that took a long time had to be learned that way. But if there was some magic involved, I think it would be getting through the real estate piece more quickly. I think it would be letting go of the MFA as the model more quickly. And yeah, that those are the two major ones.
Do you still have time to as an architect to make your own work?
Well, I have to.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I enjoy that. But it's mostly, it's just a lot right now. But I mean, you know this, but you meet some of the artists around here, and you know that they're making some really good work, and that they're very bright and talented and community oriented and civic minded. So I just feel like, and this is how I felt when I came back to Raleigh, that Raleigh was ready, that the Triangle was ready for a leap in terms of artistic voice and shaping of our culture. Historically, we're a fairly conservative area, but I just felt like the growth and the stability in a way that we've had would allow for something like small school. So I'm hopeful that we are able to move forward. And if not, then I'll probably still find ways in a different capacity to do the same things, in terms of, uh, I think of artists as people who care about our planet and the people on it through their art making. And I want to support that effort.
Hmm. I have to say, just the program of bringing established artists into a medium to small cities artist studios
Yeah.
is feels kind of like a no-brainer. You know what I mean?
Me
In
too.
terms of, it's just
Yeah.
it's a fantastic idea, and it feels like every mid-sized town should have a pro because it's not that expensive and can
Yeah.
be really transformative for an artist.
I think so. And there's the experience. I mean, I think we've all had some form of this experience where you sit at a table with someone who might have been an idol or a hero, or someone that you know is incredibly accomplished, and it's not rational, but it can validate you. You can
Hmm.
feel like I'm at the table too. And guess what? I've had a conversation with this person and I held my own. And so that's a great benefit to someone that's emerging or hasn't had the same kind of opportunity or success. And conversely, one thing that we do is that we're really thoughtful about the experience for the visiting artist. We try to make that a very engaging experience. And so, without exception, I think they all, especially the ones that have never been here, return to where they're from and think, wow, Raleigh and the
Hmm.
Triangle there's something's happening there. I had one artist who, after a few studio visits, said, what is going on here? And I said, what do you mean? He said, I mean, what do you call what's happening here? And fortunately, I was with another artist, and we both answered small school, right in unison. But this fellow was had been in San Francisco for many years, and had been there at the time of its kind of evolution in terms of experimental artworks, and he felt a similar kind of vibe.
If you'd like to learn more about JP and Small School, just head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. Please be sure to share this episode with anyone you think would enjoy it. Your recommendation really means the world to us. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Pier Carlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, thank you so much for listening.